All right, so get this, drone strikes in Kazan. Not exactly front page news, right? Except Kazan is over 600 miles deep inside Russia. So what does it mean when the Russia-Ukraine conflict suddenly hits that far from the front lines? That's what we're digging into today. And we've got a stack of news articles and even some verified video footage you want to try and make sense of.
Yeah, it's a real head scratcher at first, isn't it? You've got the immediate impact to unpack, sure, but this attack raises some seriously big questions about how this conflict is evolving.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. What actually went down in Kazan?
December 21st, 2024. 8 drones hit Kazan. We're talking 6 targeting residential buildings, 1 striking an industrial site. And luckily, another intercepted over a river before it could do any damage.
8 drones. That's not just some random isolated thing.
Exactly. This was a coordinated operation, and what's wild is that despite the damage to buildings, there were no reported casualties.
Hold on, no casualties. I mean, I get that drones aren't carpet bombing, but with that many hitting residential areas, you'd think...
It is surprising. It speaks to either a very specific targeting strategy or perhaps a deliberate attempt to minimize civilian casualties. But we can't know for sure without more information. Regardless, the disruption was significant. Flights at Kazan airport were temporarily grounded. Public gatherings were canceled. It definitely shook things up. Imagine that happening in your city. Sudden travel restrictions, events being shut down. It brings the reality of the situation a lot closer to home, doesn't it?
Definitely makes you think. You mentioned video footage earlier. Anything that really jumps out?
There's a verified video of 1 drone striking an apartment building. Smoke billowing from the impact site, debris scattering. It really brings home the destructive force of these things, even if the intent wasn't mass casualties. You have to wonder what was going through the minds of the people who witnessed that firsthand.
I can only imagine. So how does this fit into the bigger picture of what's happening between Russia and Ukraine? We can't just look at this in isolation, right?
Absolutely not. Just days before the Kazan attack, Ukraine hit Russia's Kursk region. Sadly, that one did result in fatalities, including a child. This back and forth, the increasing reach of these attacks. That's the worrying trend.
So this tit-for-tat escalation, is this a turning point, Ukraine hitting this far into Russia?
It's definitely a statement. It shows a level of capability and reach that many analysts might not have expected from Ukraine. They're able to disrupt the sense of security within Russia far beyond what we've seen before.
And did Ukraine take responsibility? Seems like a pretty bold move to just own up to.
Here's where it gets interesting. They haven't officially claimed responsibility. Ukraine has a policy of staying silent on these kinds of operations, which in a way adds to the psychological effect. It keeps everyone guessing, fuels speculation.
So they're leaving it open to interpretation, adding to the mystery. What about the Russian response?
Well, predictably, they've increased security measures. But what's significant is they also haven't let up on their own drone attacks into Ukraine. Over 100 drones were launched against Ukrainian targets right before the Kazan attack. It's a dangerous cycle, one escalation feeding the next.
So it seems like we're in this spiral of attack and retaliation with neither side backing down. This Kazan strike, though, it feels different somehow, almost like a new phase of the conflict.
You're picking up on something crucial here. This wasn't just about hitting back. This attack raises a lot of questions. Why Kazan? Why target locations that don't seem to have direct military value? It suggests a deeper strategy at play, one we need to unpack carefully.
Okay, yeah, that's what I'm getting at. So let's unpack it. What are the possible motivations behind this? What message is Ukraine trying to send? And how does this change the game going forward? I'm guessing this is where things get really interesting, right?
You could say that. There are several layers to this, each one adding to the complexity of the situation. Let's start with the strategic implications. Strategically, hitting a city like Kazan so far from the front lines sends a powerful message. It says we can reach you anywhere, anytime. That has a psychological impact that goes beyond physical damage. It disrupts that sense of normalcy of safety that Russia has tried to maintain within its borders.
It's like they're saying the war is no longer over there. It can be right here on your doorstep. I'm guessing that doesn't sit well with the Russian public?
Exactly. And that public pressure can influence political decisions. It creates a dilemma for the Kremlin. Do they downplay the attack and risk looking weak? Or do they respond forcefully and risk further escalation?
So this attack, it's almost like a chess move, forcing Russia into a difficult position. But beyond the strategic aspect, there's also the human element here, right? We can't forget about the people who live in Kazan who were suddenly caught in the crossfire.
Absolutely. Imagine the fear, the uncertainty, the sudden realization that this war, something they might have felt was distant, has now touched their lives directly.
Yeah.
That trauma, that sense of vulnerability can linger long after the physical damage is repaired.
And that trauma, it's not just limited to the people directly affected by the attacks. It ripples outwards, doesn't it? Families worried about loved ones, communities on edge, a whole society grappling with a heightened sense of insecurity.
Precisely. And that's something we need to consider when we talk about the consequences of these attacks. It's not just about the immediate damage, but the long-term psychological impact on individuals and communities.
So given this escalation, this tit for tat, is there any way back from this? Is there a path towards de-escalation, or are we just headed deeper into this conflict?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, there's no easy answer. There's a real fear of miscalculation on both sides. The more frequent these attacks become, the more brazen, the higher the risk of unintended consequences of something spiraling out of control.
It feels like we're on this knife's edge where one wrong move could have devastating consequences. It's a sobering thought.
It is. And while predicting the future is impossible, we could look at expert opinions to get a sense of the possible paths this conflict might take. There are some who believe that continued dialogue, however difficult, is the only way to prevent further escalation. Others argue that clear red lines need to be established, that Russia needs to understand the consequences of further aggression.
It sounds like there's no consensus, just a lot of uncertainty and potential for things to go very wrong.
That's the reality of this situation, unfortunately. But understanding that uncertainty, acknowledging the potential for things to escalate further, is crucial for navigating the world we live in. It's not about predicting the future, but about being prepared for different possibilities for different scenarios.
Okay, I'm with you on that. So we've covered a lot of ground here. The audacity of the attack, the strategic implications, the potential for escalation, the psychological impact on both sides. But before we wrap up, is there anything else that really stood out to you from your research? Anything you think our listeners should take away from this deep dive?
There is one thing, and it might seem obvious, but it's easy to lose sight of in the midst of all this analysis: the human cost of this conflict. Behind the headlines, the strategic maneuvering, the geopolitical chess game, there are real people whose lives are being shattered. The Kazan attack, as we've discussed, throws a real wrench into things. It challenges a lot of assumptions about the scope of the conflict, about Ukraine's capabilities, about Russia's vulnerabilities. So the question becomes, what happens next?
Yeah, it feels like we're at a crossroads. All this talk of escalation, miscalculation, it's a bit unsettling, to be honest.
It is unsettling, and it's precisely why we need to engage with these uncomfortable questions. One of the most pressing concerns is the potential for this conflict to spill over, to draw in other actors.
You're talking about NATO, right? The possibility of direct confrontation between Russia and the West.
Exactly. Up until now, NATO has been careful to provide support to Ukraine without directly engaging in combat. But this attack on Kazan, so deep inside Russia, raises the stakes considerably.
I can see how that would put pressure on NATO. If Ukraine is demonstrating a willingness to strike deep inside Russia, could that be seen as a provocation? That Russia feels compelled to respond to potentially drawing NATO into the conflict?
It's certainly a possibility that analysts are taking very seriously, and it wouldn't take much for things to spiral out of control. A miscalculation, a misunderstanding, even an accident could escalate rapidly in this kind of environment.
So we've got this potential powder keg situation on one hand, but on the other hand, we also talked about the possibility of this pushing both sides towards negotiations. How does that play out?
That's the other side of the coin, isn't it?
Yeah.
The hope is that this attack, while audacious, might actually serve as a wake-up call for both sides.
A wake-up call in what sense?
That the costs of this conflict are spiraling out of control. That the potential for catastrophic consequences is very real. It might force them to reconsider their objectives, to reassess the risks they're willing to take.
So it's like this double-edged sword. It could either escalate the conflict dramatically or create the conditions for a negotiated settlement. It's impossible to say for sure which way it will go right.
Exactly. And that uncertainty is what makes this situation so precarious. But it's precisely because the stakes are so high that we need to be having these conversations. We need to understand the complexities, the potential consequences, and the range of possible outcomes.
And that's what we're trying to do here. It's not about predicting the future, but about equipping our listeners with the knowledge and insights to make sense of what's happening and to engage in informed discussions about the future.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, this isn't just a conflict happening over there. It has the potential to impact all of us in ways we may not even fully grasp yet.
It's a sobering thought, but also a call to action. The more informed we are, the more engaged we are, the better equipped we are to navigate the challenges ahead. So if our listener takes away one thing from this deep dive, what would you want it to be?
I think the most important takeaway is the recognition that this conflict is far from over, that it's entering a new, potentially more dangerous phase. And it's not just about the military or political aspects, it's about the human cost, the ripple effects, the long-term consequences that will shape our world for years to come.
It's a lot to process, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. But I think you've given us a framework for understanding this conflict, for grappling with the uncertainty, and for engaging in meaningful conversations about the future.
That's what we aim for, to provide the context, the insights, and the tools for critical thinking so our listeners can draw their own conclusions and form their own informed opinion.
Well, I think we've accomplished that today. This deep dive into the Kazan drone strikes has definitely given me and hopefully our listener a lot to think about.
I hope so, because in a world where information is power, knowledge is our greatest defense.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. As these attacks continue, as the conflict evolves, what do you see as the most likely scenario? And how might that scenario impact the world at large? It's a question worth pondering, worth discussing, worth keeping at the forefront of our minds as we navigate these uncertain times. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll be back soon with another exploration into the events shaping our world. Until then, stay curious, you're informed, and stay engaged.